thinking about that, the Israeli midterm or long-term plan, meaning what happens when this bombing campaign finally comes to an end, when the ground invasion either turns into some sort of partial occupation, reoccupation of Gaza or some international force or whatever. If you look at the scope of the destruction in northern Gaza, there have been reports that 60% of all buildings, if not destroyed, are architecturally compromised, not safe to inhabit. The sewage system, the electrical system, the hospital system are completely destroyed. I mean, to some extent, northern Gaza has been rendered in a large degree uninhabitable in terms of just any kind of modern society. How would these internally displaced Gazans who are now in southern Gaza and dispersed throughout the country really in any reasonable or meaningful way get back to any kind of meaningful or normal life in northern Gaza, even if the Israelis were to permit that?
Well, I think rendering northern Gaza uninhabitable was actually a declared war aim. The Minister of Defense, Gallant, various Israeli generals said that. And when you cut off electricity and you cut off water, you are in effect making the place uninhabitable. When you destroy or render unusable most of the hospitals in northern Gaza, when you destroy schools, when you destroy a variety of other infrastructure, you are rendering northern Gaza uninhabitable. Now, the claim is that this was intended to destroy Hamas infrastructure. But my guess is that there was, as they said, a desire to render that part, at least, of Gaza uninhabitable. Now, you can see that there's a doctrine here. It's a doctrine that was first adopted in 2006, or at least first enunciated after the 2006 war on Lebanon. And it was the so-called Dahia doctrine, Dahia being the southern suburbs of Beirut, which were flattened by Israeli bombing in 2006. And the man who is now a member of the war cabinet, a former chief of staff by the name of Gadi Eisenkot, actually enunciated this. He said, we will not, accept proportionality. We will act unproportionally, and we will flatten villages. We will do what we did to the Dahia. In other words, we will destroy in order to destroy in a punitive fashion. And I think that is what Israel is doing. Now, what that means for the day after, well, I think it's connected in the first instance to what they were hoping, which is to get people out of Gaza, decrease the Palestinian population within the borders of mandatory Palestine. In other words, launch another stage of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. If that proves impossible, the next best thing is to squeeze them into a smaller area, maybe push them into southern Gaza. But I don't think that any of these things are necessarily beyond rendering Gaza uninhabitable, which the Minister of Defense said. I don't think any of these things are entirely clear. And I think, as you suggested, there are multiple factions in this government. The military has its own views. The prime minister, who basically wants to continue the war and not lose this government, which keeps him in power, failing which he would go to trial, presumably. And then other factions within the government, the Likud party, the extreme right-wing parties, which want to see ethnic cleansing as soon as possible and as much of Palestine as possible, and so forth. So it's, to me, frankly, and I'm reading the Israeli press carefully, it's not clear that they have a clear idea or a unified idea of what they want to do with the Gazans once this military campaign is over, whenever it's over.
On this stated goal of destroying Hamas, I don't think we ever got clarity about exactly what that means, although the Israelis made clear from the beginning, from Netanyahu on down, they said, we don't mean we're going to erode the power of Hamas. We don't mean we're going to undermine it. We don't mean we're going to weaken Hamas. We mean we're going to destroy it, eradicate it, remove it from existing in Gaza. Obviously, with a war like this, facts are hard to come by, so let's just take the Israeli numbers, the numbers given by the Israeli military. According to the Israeli military, they have thus far killed 1,500 to 2,000 Hamas militants. So let's take the maximum number, 2,000. And according to the Israelis as well, there are 30,000 Hamas fighters. So they've killed 1/15 of all the Hamas fighters that existed at the start of the war. Presumably there's going to be more anti-Israel radicals and people who hate Israel after this destruction that they've witnessed, after the amount of death. But let's just keep that number in place. 30,000 Hamas militants. That would mean, in order to kill all Hamas militants, just the minimum necessary, I would assume, to achieve this goal of destroying Hamas, they would have to kill 15 times more Hamas militants than they have thus far. And at the current rate of civilian death, that would mean that they would basically end up killing 200,000, 250,000 Gazans in total. Do you think there is any world in which the world just stands by and watches something like that take place?
No, absolutely not. The United States wouldn't tolerate it because the Biden administration couldn't tolerate it because public opinion is already against this war. A majority of Americans are in favor of a ceasefire. They want it to stop. They do not accept the Biden administration and the Israeli government's insistence on continuing the war until, quote unquote, Hamas is destroyed, whatever that means. I mean, whether it means killing 20,000 odd more Hamas militants and God knows how many thousand more civilians, tens of thousands more civilians, and destroying even more of the infrastructure of Gaza. If 60% has already been rendered uninhabitable and unusable, God knows how much more there is to destroy. But I do not think that world public opinion, Arab public opinion, but for that matter, American public opinion, will put up with that. I think there'll be a rebellion within the Democratic Party. I think the president would be guaranteed of losing the 2024 election, and I think that he would be obliged to stop this long before we got to those apocalyptic numbers. So I don't think that there is any possibility of our reaching anything like those numbers, even if those numbers are realistic. I mean, let's assume that they're highly exaggerated, which I think is the case. I don't think there's any chance of killing 10 or 20,000 Hamas militants, no matter how many civilians Israel kills. And no matter how many tunnels. You read the Israeli military correspondence, and they're saying they've done very limited damage to the tunnel system. Well, they've dropped how many thousand tons of bombs a day, a week on Gaza, and they still have only minimally damaged the tunnel system. They've killed 2,000 of, by their estimate, 30,000 militants. It just does not seem to me within the world of possibility that this could go on to that extent. How it stops, however, I don't know.
You're somebody who's followed this conflict for most of your career as a scholar, as an academic, as a historian. You've referred to on a couple of occasions this public opinion that has turned against the Democratic Party, against Joe Biden for his support of what's taking place in Israel. I do think there's an interesting dynamic that it is the case that for a lot of years now, maybe going back to 2014, the Israeli-Palestinian issue has pretty much been on the back burner of American politics. So you have all these young people who have started to pay attention to politics for the first time, a lot of people who paid attention to politics for the first time only because of Trump. This is the first real look they're getting at Israel and the Democratic Party's relationship to it. And you have these mass protests all over the world, hundreds of thousands of people in major Western cities. Like, you have to go back to the Iraq War to find protests on this level. As somebody who has followed this conflict, has been in the middle of it in so many ways for so long now, is this a kind of radical or fundamental change in terms of public opinion and the amount of opposition to what the Israelis are doing and the way in which the U.S. is supporting them?
I mean, there has been a trend in this direction, but I think you put your finger on it. I think that this is a moment when a newly awakened generation with new access to information is, for the first time, really looking very carefully at things that are happening in Israel and Palestine. And they clearly do not like what they see. There's an NBC poll that came out the other day of voters from 18 to 34. 70% of voters in that age group disapprove of the Biden administration's handling of this war. That's an astonishing percentage. I mean, a majority of Americans want a ceasefire, but that 70% of young voters, that includes Republicans and independents. I mean, that's a remarkable number. And it's part of a trend that I think has really been accentuated by this war. But that's been going on for actually a very long time. The polling over many years shows a drift away from sympathy for Israel and towards greater sympathy for the Palestinians. And this war has crystallized that, I think.
Yeah, so for those of us who have followed this debate, this conflict for a long time, there's all the arguments that everybody can rehearse in their sleep. You show people the death tolls in Gaza, and people say, oh, Hamas uses them as human shields. Hamas operates from hospitals. They operate from mosques. All the arguments that everybody knows and knows the responses to. I do want to ask you about a couple of perspectives that are, I think, the most potent ones that Israelis and pro-Israel supporters in the United States and the West offer. And I want to begin by asking you this. In almost every war, there's two questions, broadly speaking, I think, that need to be asked. One is there a moral or legal justification for the war, for the force being used? And then, is it a wise use of force, even if it's morally justifiable? Will it produce benefits on the whole as opposed to detriments? After the October 7th massacre that did kill hundreds of civilians, whatever that number is, 500, 800, 900, whatever that amount is, do you think Israel had a legal and moral right to use force in Gaza against the group and the people who perpetrated that attack?
You know, the problem with that question is its framing. Gaza had been under siege for 16 years. Israel had assumed that it could live a peaceful, quiet life while putting its boot heel on the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And sooner or later, that had to explode. Now, it exploded in a particularly ugly fashion with these massacres. It resulted in the highest death toll among Israeli civilians in the entire history of Israel's wars since 1948. So there was going to be a reaction, necessarily and inevitably. But if you step back 1 minute, I think it's very clear that if you occupy and if you imprison and blockade and besiege a population, sooner or later that population is going to react violently and negatively. Israelis talk about this as if it's irrational. It's not irrational at all. The nature of the violence is, of course, horrific that was carried out on that day. But when you do this to people and you pretend that out of sight is out of mind, and you can live a normal life in suburban communities with other people in a cage within a couple of miles of you, you are storing up problems that sooner or later are going to erupt. So did Israel have a right to occupy in the first instance? Did Israel have a right to kick those people out in 1948 in the second instance? I mean, you can go on and on and on. The people in Gaza are 80% refugees from the areas that Hamas invaded on the 7th of October. So it really depends on where you start and where your perspective is on this. If you assume that everything was peaceful, and this is France and Germany, or this is country A and country B, where country A simply decides to launch a murderous assault on the civilians of country B, then of course country B has the right to counterattack. But this is not country A and country B. This is an occupier and an occupied population. And this is a settler colonial project where the people living in settlements around the Gaza Strip are living on lands that used to belong to people who have now been living, or their ancestors, their parents and grandparents have been living as refugees in the Gaza Strip since 1948. And you have to factor that in. Does an occupying power have the right to attack an occupied population? You should be asking, I think, those kinds of questions, as well as the question, what should Israel have done? Well, Israel shouldn't have been in occupation of the West Bank in the Gaza Strip in the first place. There should have been a Palestinian state. There should have been any number of things should have been, the absence of which have led to this horrific situation that we're in, where at least 800 Israeli civilians have been killed, at least 450 or more Israeli soldiers and security personnel have been killed, and apparently over 15,000 Palestinians, both civilians and militants, have been killed. And we're not at the end of it. I mean, assuming that this ceasefire breaks down over the next several days, we're going to see much higher casualty totals. And I think at the end of this, you'd have to ask that question. What was achieved? What was the point of this? Have they stored up more enmity for Israel? Have they improved Israel's position? Are Israelis more secure as a result of killing 15,000 Palestinians, including a huge number of children and women and other non-combatants? I don't think the answer is yes. I don't think you achieve security in that fashion. And I'm not just saying that from an Israeli perspective. I would say that from a Palestinian perspective as well. Sooner or later, there has to be a political resolution of this. I don't think we're nearer to a political resolution as a result of this, not only, I think, because of whatever happened on the 7th of October, but because of the 15 times greater toll that has so far been inflicted by Israel since the 7th of October. And that toll will only, unfortunately, probably increase.
I'm always amazed at the ability for Western media outlets and governments to just define history however they want. They did the same thing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They just pretended that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in the West began on February of 2022, as opposed to having extended many years back, without which you can't possibly understand what happened in February of 2022. And of course, the attempt to pretend that there was no conflict until October 7th, and it all started when Hamas invaded Israel. But your answer essentially says that the best thing for Israel to do from its own perspective, from the perspective of morality and legality, is to resolve the underlying conflict so that there's no more motive for Palestinians to attack Israel. The standard argument, which I am interested in hearing your view on, is that Hamas has made very clear they don't want a two-state solution. The reason Netanyahu propped up Hamas was precisely because he thought they would work symbiotically to prevent a two-state solution, so that wouldn't resolve the hostility of Hamas, say Israel defenders. And then more interestingly, I think I want to ask you, is a two-state solution possible given the extent of the settlement project in the West Bank?
I mean, my short answer to the second part of your question is no. Unless you deal with occupation and colonization, you should not even utter the words two-state solution. A two-state solution in which Israel continues to settle, or in which 750,000 Israeli citizens maintain their residence and their colonization of Palestinian lands, is not a two-state solution. It's a one-state solution with a one-state, one Bantustan solution. A situation in which Israel continues its occupation is not a two-state solution. And every Israeli generous offer, has included Israeli control of the Jordan River Valley, which means it's not a state. I mean, imagine if a foreign country controlled the border with Mexico and the border with Canada. Would we be a sovereign state, the United States? Of course not. The first part of your question, I think that you have to look at this in terms of how you end this conflict. Do you end it in a fashion which maintains a structural inequality, where one group has rights and security at the expense of the rights and security of the other? Where one group proclaims, as the Israeli nation-state law proclaims, that only the Jewish people have the right of sovereignty in the land of Israel? Or do you have a solution, whether it's a one-state or a two-state solution, in which both peoples and every individual have equal rights? How you do that, I don't know. I don't think that a two-state solution is possible in present circumstances, because nobody's talking about the elephants in the room. Nobody's talking about ending Israeli security control. Nobody's talking about ending settlement. And if you don't do that, even if the Palestinians accept the measly 22% of historic Palestine, which comprise the West Bank, occupied Arab East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, even if they accept that unjust partition of Palestine, you have to get 750,000 Israelis out of there, or figure out how they continue to live.
Heavily armed Israeli settlers backed by major components of the IDF, if not most.
Precisely.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.